Today I'm going to take you through 12 key watercolour techniques that will really help you improve your watercolour work, especially those of you that do landscapes and want to blend your backgrounds, or if you're doing portraits and want to do smoother skin tone. I will also take you through some techniques where you can use everyday household items to improve the texture and to do some really fun different techniques. So let's get on with the tutorial. So first we're going to try wet on wet technique. You start by putting a layer of clean water onto the paper. Today I'm using Winsor & Newton Cotman, and I am using Archer's 300 GSM cold pressed paper. So it's good to use wet on wet technique for landscapes and also for skin tone in portraits. The reason it's a good technique to use for these particular subjects is because it doesn't have harsh edges and you don't want to see these edges on your work. Because you've applied your waters first, it means that your colour blends seamlessly, and that is why it's good for these backgrounds and skin tones. The only thing that makes this technique difficult is because you don't have control over the water, and it means sometimes the paint takes its own direction. I would suggest that you practice this before you work with wet on wet technique on a larger painting, or if it's something that you have spent a lot of time sketching out. And be careful with the amount of water that you put on the paper at first, because the more water you put on at first, the less control that you have over the paint. So the next technique is more abstract and is really good for those that are starting on their watercolour journey. And this one requires you to put more water onto the surface and is really experimental. And as I said, it's more abstract and is really good for backgrounds. So the next technique is good for doing gradients, and so you can have more control. So the first thing you need to do is to apply some water to your background, and then what you need to do is to add a layer of your colour that you want to use. This brush pen that I am using, there is a link in the description below. It's a pack of brush pens, and you fill it with water and then you apply that water as you need it, and then you add your gradient to whatever you are painting at the time, and you have more control over it than you would have if you are using wet on wet technique. So the next technique that I'm going to be showing you now involves everyday household salt. All you will need to do is to do basic wet on wet technique using your background colour, or you could use a variety of colours, and then you sprinkle salt on top. You wait for it to dry, and then when it's dried you just simply brush the salt off, and then underneath will be revealed the salt technique of your watercolour paint. So this next technique is really good for if you're trying to pick out highlights when you're using watercolours. I like to use it when I'm painting clouds. So here I'm painting a sky effect. I'm just using cerulean blue, and then I will use the paper towel to pick out some highlights for the clouds, which I find very effective. This next technique works equally well with oil pastel because it's working on the principle of the wax or the oil-based material resisting the watercolour, because oil or wax don't mix with watercolour. So I've drawn out first my design with the wax crayon, and then I'm putting the watercolour on top. This works even better if you use a light crayon or oil pastel and then a darker paint on top, because you have the contrast of the two colours. So if you don't have an oil pastel or a wax crayon, you could also use a candle. A lot of these techniques I'm showing you is to show you that you can use things around your house to experiment with these techniques. So I've just drawn some quick designs with the wax candle, and it works in the same way as a wax crayon. You paint on top, as I said. Really good idea to use a darker paint because it then shows the contrast between the paint and the design. This technique works really well for a variety of landscape effects. Say for example on a tree bark if you're trying to get a particular texture, or if you're trying to create the effect of ice. So experiment with different colours to try and get different textures with placing cling film on top, and be careful how you arrange the cling film if you're trying to get a particular effect. You should also make sure that you wait for the paint to dry before you lift the cling film away from the paint. So this particular technique is really good if you're trying to achieve highlights in a portrait or on a landscape, particularly if they're very detailed highlights. So you start by applying the masking fluid either with a pen, or you can buy masking fluid in bottles and apply it with a paintbrush. And it's really important that you wait for the masking fluid to dry. You then apply your paint on top once the masking fluid is dry, and then you need to rub the masking fluid away from the dry paint. I usually do this with a paper towel, but you can do it with your fingers. So for this technique, you apply your paint as you would with the normal wet on wet technique. Leave the water so it's wet, and then apply drops of water. You can do this with a paintbrush, but I prefer to do it with a pipette because it gives it more of a drop technique. On dry technique is for more detailed areas of your painting. So you would either wait for the background colour to be completely dry, or you could just paint this directly onto dry paper. And this is where you are painting your details. The reason why you need to wait for your paint to be completely dry is that if you apply the wet paint onto wet paper, it will expand and you'll get the last technique that I'm going to show you is another one for if you want to add highlights, and that is adding white gouache to the top of your paint. This is really good if you want to add large areas of highlights. You could use it for small areas, but the reason why I like to add gouache is because it's an opaque paint, so it sits on top of the surface. If you're going to add small details, you'd probably be better off adding the details with a white gel pen. So I'm just showing you the larger area there, and then this is how you could apply flicker design with the gouache with a toothbrush. So that's just to show you a variety of techniques that you could use with gouache paint. If you enjoyed this clip, then make sure you check out more clips like this in the watercolour playlist. Don't forget to look in the description below for details of products used in today's clip, and if you have any ideas for content or questions, then leave a comment below. Finally, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell to be notified of future content.